quiet corners of the world, the shadows hold stories that beg to be uncovered. Welcome to Silent Shadows, a place where mysteries thrive and suspense keeps you guessing. Each episode takes you deeper into the unknown, challenging you to find the clues hidden in plain sight. Let's begin this journey into the dark, where every silence speaks volumes.
The Wailing House, a mystery story by GravepitShadows. The town of Westfall had a reputation for quiet streets and neighborly kindness. But in hushed tones, the townsfolk spoke of something else, a shadow over their town in the form of the Wailing House. Nestled at the edge of town, the abandoned Victorian mansion had long been the subject of ghost stories. Few dared to approach it, and fewer returned with their nerves intact. Over the past month, however, whispers turned to screams. Lauren Carter, a realtor, disappeared while showing the property to prospective buyers. Her last voicemail to her fiancé was a frantic plea. "It's crying. I think it's lost, but..." The line cut abruptly. Mark Grayson, a thrill-seeking teenager, accepted a dare to explore the house with a friend. Only his friend returned, hysterical, unable to explain what had happened. Andy Denton, a utility worker sent to investigate a reported outage near the house, left behind a voicemail for his wife. "There's a kid in there, crying. I'm going to check it out." Then silence. Detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport stood at the rusted iron gates of the house, its jagged peaks silhouetted against a fading sunset. "This is the third case in as many weeks," Rachel said, her voice tinged with frustration. She was a pragmatic investigator, driven by logic but haunted by a recent case that had gone cold. James gave a half-hearted grin. "Creepy house, weird disappearances. Sounds like a bad movie." He didn't admit it, but the place unsettled him. The air felt heavy, and the house seemed to watch them. Rachel checked her notes. "Let's focus. 3 people missing. All reported hearing a crying child. If someone's using this house as bait, we'll find them." The gate creaked open as if inviting them in. Neither of them spoke as they approached the front door. The house stood in eerie stillness, its peeling paint and shattered windows giving it a skeletal appearance. Ivy crept up its walls, strangling what remained of its structure. The wind whispered through the dead trees surrounding it, a sound like faint voices. Rachel tested the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the door swung inward with a long, agonizing creak. The detectives exchanged a glance. "Friendly," James muttered. Inside, the air was colder, damp with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust clung to every surface. The floorboards groaned underfoot as they stepped into the foyer, where a once grand chandelier hung askew, its crystals dulled by grime. "You feel that?" James asked. He wasn't sure how to describe it, but the air seemed to pulse faintly, like the house had a heartbeat. Rachel nodded, her hand instinctively brushing the grip of her sidearm. "Stay sharp." The silence was broken by a faint sound, like a child crying, coming from somewhere upstairs. Rachel's stomach tightened. It was distant, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" she asked. James shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" They moved carefully through the house, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The grandeur of the place was evident even in its decay. Ornate moldings framed the walls, and faded wallpaper hinted at the house's former beauty. Yet, there was something fundamentally wrong about it, like the house had been waiting for them. In the dining room, Rachel froze. At the head of a long, dust-covered table sat a porcelain doll, its dress pristine despite the years of neglect around it. Its painted eyes gleamed in the beam of her flashlight. "James," she called softly, her voice tight. He joined her, and they stared at the doll. It was immaculate, its hands positioned neatly in its lap. When Rachel turned away to scan the rest of the room, James swore under his breath. "What?" Rachel asked. It moved. Rachel shone her light back on the doll. It hadn't moved, but something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for them to look away again. In the library, Rachel's beam of light landed on a worn leather journal half buried under a pile of decaying books. She brushed away the dust and opened it, revealing elegant handwriting that grew more erratic with each page. It belonged to Tremaine Holloway, the mother of the girl in the painting. Rachel read aloud. "Emily has been gone for weeks, but I hear her at night. Her cries wake me, and I cannot bear it. If the spirits can bring her back, I must try. I will do anything." The entries became frantic. "The crying won't stop. It's not her. It wants more." The final pages were scrawled in large, jagged letters. "It's here." As Rachel read, the room grew colder. The flashlight flickered, and James turned sharply. "What was that?" he asked. Rachel followed his gaze, her stomach dropping. The handprints were faint, but they were there. Small, childlike, pressed into the dust on the wall behind them. They were not alone. The staircase to the basement was narrow, the walls damp and covered in a dark moss that seemed to glisten unnaturally in the light. Rachel's flashlight dimmed as they descended, and the air grew heavier with every step. The basement was a cavernous space with crumbling brick walls. At its center was an altar surrounded by melted candles and broken toys. Symbols were etched into the floor, jagged, unfamiliar shapes that seemed to pulse faintly. A soft sobbing filled the air, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Emily?" Rachel called out, her voice unsteady. The sobbing stopped abruptly. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. It was small, childlike, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, almost insect-like. It stepped into the light, revealing hollow eyes and elongated limbs. James stepped back instinctively. "That's not a kid," he whispered. The figure darted toward Rachel, and for a moment, icy fingers gripped her wrist. She gasped, and the figure vanished. Shaken by their encounter in the basement, Rachel and James returned to their car, the oppressive weight of the house lingering like a second skin. Neither spoke until they reached the edge of town, where Dr. Evelyn Parks lived in a quaint, cluttered house filled with books and occult artifacts. Dr. Parks was an expert on the supernatural, though Rachel approached her with skepticism. "This house has a dark history," Parks began, motioning for them to sit. "Tremaine Holloway was consumed by grief after her daughter Emily's death. Desperate to bring her back, she turned to rituals, dangerous ones." Rachel pulled out the journal. "We found this. It mentions a ritual and something else." Dr. Parks examined it carefully. "Tremaine invited something into our world. It's not Emily, but it's using her cries to lure victims. It's bound to the house, feeding on fear and life." James leaned forward. "So we destroy the house and the locket, right?" "No." Park's tone was grave. "If you destroy the locket without the proper ritual, the entity will be unleashed. The only way to stop it is to sever its connection to this world." Parks handed Rachel a page torn from an old book. It contained a series of symbols and a ritual requiring a sacrifice of personal significance. "What kind of sacrifice?" Rachel asked. "One that hurts," Parks replied. "Something meaningful, something the entity can't ignore." The detectives returned to the house at dusk. The shadows seemed longer, darker than before, and the air felt heavier with malevolence. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them. "Classic horror movie move," James muttered, trying to lighten the mood. This time, the house wasted no time. The lights from their flashlights flickered as whispers filled the air. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Rachel, you left me." She froze. The voice was her father's, filled with pain and accusation. Memories surged, of her father dying in the hospital while she was stuck in a traffic jam, unable to say goodbye. Her flashlight flickered out completely, plunging her into darkness. "Rachel!" James's voice brought her back, but he was facing his own terror. In a cracked mirror on the wall, his reflection stared back at him, grinning maliciously while he stood still. The mirror shattered, and the whispers rose to a cacophony. "We need to move," Rachel said, her voice shaking. They found the attic door, marked with symbols carved into the wood. It took all their strength to push it open, revealing a room that felt alive with malevolence. The attic was a grotesque shrine. Emily's crib sat at the center, surrounded by ritual markings drawn in blood. Inside the crib was the locket, glowing faintly. The walls were covered in faded children's drawings, houses, trees, and a family, but the figures became distorted and monstrous toward the edges. The air grew freezing as the locket pulsed, and the room began to quake. Then, the entity materialized. It was Emily, or rather, what Emily had become. Her limbs were grotesquely elongated, her face a mask of twisted rage, and her hollow eyes burned with malice. "You won't take it!" she screamed, her voice shaking the room. Objects flew across the attic as the entity lunged at Rachel, who barely dodged in time. James raised his flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. "Rachel, we need to start the ritual, now!" Rachel pulled out the ritual page as the entity circled them, its movements erratic and unnervingly fast. She began chanting the incantation, her voice trembling. The locket's glow intensified, and the entity screamed, shaking the walls violently. The house fought back. Shadows writhed along the walls, clawing at the detectives. A heavy wooden beam fell, narrowly missing James. The entity's form flickered, growing more monstrous with each passing moment. "The sacrifice!" Rachel gasped, pulling a photo from her pocket. It was a picture of her and her father, the only one she had kept since his death. Her hand trembled as she held it over the ritual flames. "You don't have to do this," James said, but she shook her head. "This is for you, Emily," Rachel whispered, dropping the photo into the fire. The locket burned brightly as the entity shrieked, its form fracturing. The room filled with light, blinding them as the entity was pulled into the locket. The house began to collapse around them. Rachel and James sprinted down the stairs as the walls crumbled and the ceiling buckled. The house groaned like a dying beast, its structure folding inward. They burst through the front door just as the entire building imploded, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. They stood in stunned silence, watching the ruins smolder. At the center of the rubble lay the charred remains of the locket. "Do we leave it there?" James asked, still catching his breath. "No," Rachel said firmly. They retrieved the locket and delivered it to Dr. Parks, who promised to seal it away in a secure vault. Weeks later, Dr. Parks stood in her archive, placing the locket inside a reinforced glass case. She locked it with a key and stepped back, satisfied that the nightmare was over. But as she turned to leave, a faint sobbing echoed through the room. She froze, her breath hitching as the sound grew louder. Turning slowly, she saw the locket glowing faintly, its clasp clicking open on its own. The sound of a child's laughter lingers.
Another tale has come to a close, but the shadows never rest. Thank you for exploring this mystery with us on Silent Shadows. If you enjoyed this episode, show your support by hitting like, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing for more gripping stories. What was your favorite clue? What theories did you have? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your wits sharp. The shadows have much more to reveal.